Video. What were some key concepts in that video that you learned? We had to summarize it. What is it? Come on, don't be shy. What did we learn about interviewing specifically? Do we need to watch it again? What did you learn about interviewing from that short video? And by the way, I mean, I made myself clear earlier, but that's obviously the Pulitzer Center is providing grants for stories that aren't being covered. That's why I talked about Africa. So you saw a lot of the stories that they were showing here as a demonstration were from Africa and other places that are being ignored by the international media. So they're important stories being ignored, and they fund those. And so these are, these are grants you might want to go after. Create a team and try to, find a topic that is being ignored. Here in Southeast Asia, there are probably plenty of stories here that are being ignored by the international media and that you could cover. So it's an idea for you to think about. Okay, so what did they say about who you should interview? What sort of people should you interview and what sort of questions should you ask them? Should you interview an expert? Come on, people. Yeah, you should interview experts, but should you also interview victims? Yeah, you should interview victims and observers. So you want experts, you want victims, you want observers, and they all have a different role in your story. He mentioned that it is good to have, especially in this sort of a short video, kind of a mini documentary sort of video is what they're going for typically. Is you will want a main character who can help tell the story, but you bring in other people as well. But you kind of tell the story through one person's eyes. It helps it be more of a story. You're a storyteller in this, and you want people to pay attention throughout the short documentary. And so you need a storyteller. And so you find your storyteller. That may be the victim, it may be the expert, or it may be a neutral observer, whoever can tell the best story. But you also want to involve the others as well. What can the expert tell you that the victim cannot tell you, and what can the victim tell you that the expert cannot tell you? What? Hello, are we here? What can the expert tell you that the victim cannot tell you? What sort of things? He could give you the bigger picture. He could give you the statistics. If people are dying in Africa, he can tell you how many are dying. He can probably give you more of the background of the storm that hit the coast of Africa, its velocity and all that, all the particulars of the storm. He can tell you. But what can the victim tell you that the expert can't tell you? The victim tell you what it felt like to be in that storm. The victim can tell you what it felt like to lose a family member. And those are things the expert can't tell you. So you get the right combination of people in a multi-source story, which is what we're trying to do for the written one. It's the same principle, right? I mean, yes, you can get two experts, but depending on the story you're writing, you could get an expert and a victim if there's a victim to the story. And so there's a variety of ways of doing it. The example I've given you already was a story written about a victim and an expert. The woman whose daughter was killed by a gang and the police officer who had to fight them on a regular basis and knew all the statistical background for that community. And so that was more like this one, a victim and an expert. It was a little more compelling. It makes it a little more compelling if you have a story like that, because in the example I gave you, who told the story first? The victim did, because the victim has a more compelling story. Um, the Wall Street Journal deals with lots of stories with lots of statistics. Lots of experts want to be um, quoted in the Wall Street Journal. Well, what is the Wall Street Journal's main focus? Yeah, the economy, business. It's a business newspaper. It covers other news as well, but it focuses on the economy and on business. So, like I say, lots of economics, a lot of dry statistics. And so their rule is if you can find an angle, start with a story. Start with somebody's story. So if it's a story about unemployment, who are you going to talk to? Somebody who's unemployed, right? You talk to the victim. The fact they've been unemployed for a year and they're running out of money and their family suffering from it. So you start off with the story of the individual, and then you bring in the expert who says there's, you know, 5 million people in America unemployed, whatever. Now that doesn't have to be true right now, because right now they have record-setting employment in America. But if that were the case, it's just an example. So the story of the victim. Then once you feel what that victim is feeling, now the expert says there's 5 million people out there like this. Now you can sympathize with the 5 million. If you start with the 5 million, it's kind of like talking about the 1,000 in Africa. You know, a million here, a million there, it's not bothering me. But if you capture my heart, with the victim story, now I care about the 5 million. And so that can be a very effective way to handle a story. Interviewing two people, the victim and the expert. Again, not all stories that you want to write will be like that, and I don't expect them to be. It's a very good way to do a story, but you understand why the Wall Street Journal approaches it that way. Otherwise, nobody would read the Wall Street Journal. Okay, if all it was statistic after statistic after statistic, the Wall Street Journal would not exist right now. They would not have any readers. And so you have to humanize statistics in order to make statistics interesting and of value. That's one of the things I helped start I may have mentioned a training program in Central Asia for non-government organizations that help a lot of people. And so anyway, when I got involved, an American Peace Corps worker wanted to hold one conference and write one book, co-authored by leaders in the different NGOs in Central Asia, because they didn't think that the people on the front line, so to speak, were having their story told. That the international funding organizations were directing all the charitable activities in Central Asia, and they were not on the front lines. They didn't understand the challenges. And so she had worked with a lot of NGOs, as they're called, and she wanted an opportunity to let them tell their story. So she came to me as a publisher, an editor and publisher, said, will you help me do this? And I said, I said, I will, but not for a one time only. This is too important of a project to do one time. And so now it's been in existence for 10 years. It's been funded with $10 million. It's now covering all of Central Asia, all the way over to Azerbaijan, which I don't think is in Asia, but anyway. But throughout that region, all the stands and Azerbaijan, because it is important. And so one of the main, my focus in doing it was to help them tell their story better. So this is part of what I told them, is that don't just tell me how many people your NGO helped. Tell me the story of the people, individual people you helped. Start with them. Give me pictures of them. So that's the other thing that I would say that you should have learned from this video, is you cannot just think about the story in words. Even if you're a print journalist, I, as a print editor and journalist and publisher, I need photos. I need art. And so while she was talking about video, you still have to think that way if you're a print journalist. If you have powerful art, then people read your story. If you don't have powerful art, chances are they're not going to read your story. Art is as important to a print journalist as video is to a video journalist. And so if you are a print journalist and you don't think about art, you're not doing your job. Art is your best friend. And so I've also been a photojournalist all of my career because I learned that very early, and because of the sort of newspapers I was working for and editing and publishing, I typically did not have a separate photographer. All journalists had to do their own photography. So I had to learn how to be a good photojournalist, not just a writer. Yeah, and then that became even more important as an editor because I had to design the pages. And I realized, it wasn't just my story I was worried about, but it's all the stories in a publication I was responsible for. How do I get people to come to my newspaper and read my newspaper? How do I get them to read all the stories in the newspaper? And that's all about art, designing the pages, having the right art, knowing when to use big pictures, small pictures, a combination of them, how to get people's eyes to flow across the page and not abandon it. And so it's the content of the art, the design of the pages, all that becomes important for a print journalist. Obviously, if you're an editor and publisher, it becomes increasingly important to you because it's your bottom line. Readership is what you're selling when you sell advertising. You're selling people's attention. If you have nobody's attention, you have no advertising. They are not idiots. The first newspaper I worked for had a lot of idiots involved with it. The owner of it sent his son, who was about my age, and I was 23 at the time. So he sent his 23-year-old son to be the general manager. He already had kind of a company president, and the company president was totally unethical. And the lack of ethics in the news business is deadly. It is suicidal, deadly. So one of the things the president did was when he launched the newspaper, here's a brand new newspaper in the city of Tampa, and he told them he was going to launch with 70,000 copies of the paper first week. Bam. And so he went out. He was printing. He had already established a printing business, so he was printing flyers for some of the biggest advertisers in the area, the big grocery stores and the big department stores, the big malls. He already had their business. He had their attention. He was in a great situation, and he went out and told them, day one, I'm going to have 70,000 people reading your advertising. That was the stupidest thing you could possibly do. Just because, first off, could he get 70,000 papers out to readers at all in his first week? He couldn't. If he did get 70,000 newspapers out to readers, would they read them first week? They'd never heard of the newspaper before. They didn't have a good designer. They didn't have a good editor. They didn't have particularly good writers. I wasn't there yet, so I guess I'm not being modest in that, but what I brought to it was how to write better, how to get people's attention, how to make it look better, because I understood it was all about readership. The success of that newspaper was totally about readership. Without readership, you have nothing. Anyway, the president lying to people about it meant that he must have thought they were idiots, because he must have thought he could get away with it, obviously. So here he was lying to them about how many he could put out, how many people would be read, and he got them to buy advertising from them. And within 1 month, he lost all those advertisers, and in most cases, never got them back, ever. A little bit of a business side of media. If you're going to lie the other direction. He should have told them, we might have 20 or 30,000 readers this week. And he should have tried to put out 70,000 because you're not going to have a lot of readership that first time. So if anything, lie the other direction, and price it accordingly. At first, your price for advertising should be very low because you do not have readership yet. And that is what you're selling. You're selling people's attention. Whether you're a TV producer or a newspaper producer or whatever you're producing in the media, you are selling people's attention if you're selling advertising. If you do not have their attention, you have nothing to sell. So anyway, that's the problem. That's what's happening in the mainstream media right now is they're losing people's attention. And so newspapers in America have lost more than 2/3 of all their advertising. Where is people's attention going to? Internet. All the advertising going to the internet. And the newspapers have not figured out. I've written a book chapter about how to save America's newspapers. And the first thing they have to understand, and according to my chapter, which I obviously believe, the first thing they need to understand is they're not competing against each other anymore. If anything, they should be cooperating with each other because they're being killed by Google and Facebook. And if they don't understand that they need to compete against Google and Facebook, they are going to continue to die. And so far, they haven't figured that out. So far, they think that they're like people fighting to get onto a lifeboat. You know, your Titanic has sunk, and you have a lifeboat, and everybody's trying to get on the lifeboat to survive. And in the effort, that lifeboat's going to turn over, and they may all die. Maybe one person, two people, a few people will live, and the rest will die. That's the state of the media in America right now. They're all struggling for the lifeboat. But anyway, they haven't figured out who they're competing with. And they've not done a very good job of doing it. So consequently, they have very little advertising online, and their print advertising is going down, 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 down. And they're dying. The company I used to work for with the daily newspaper is one of the biggest newspaper publishers in America, McClatchy. And as part of that story, I mentioned that year they were enthusiastic. That year they only lost $20 million. Wow, they're doing better. They only lost 20 million. Well, 20 million here and 20 million there, and pretty soon you're out of business. So to be enthusiastic about only losing 20 million is putting on a good face to a bad problem. So, okay. Okay. So what could we have also learned from the discussion of the visual part of storytelling? Don't walk too far away from this or I'll lose my audio like I did before. So I need to stay somewhat within this range. So what? What about the visuals? What did it say about talking heads? Does it like talking heads? No. What is a talking head? What's an example of a talking head? So basically it's the interview or it's the broadcaster, the anchorman in a TV news program. If all you do is have the anchor, what we call an anchor, in your news program and all he's doing is talking to the camera the whole time and telling you the news, pretty soon you're going to tune out. That TV show is gone. Nobody's going to be interested in a talking head. Okay, now there are still some, like in public broadcasting in America, they might have, and in Fox News, there's a lot of, they might bring in guests and have a roundtable discussion, something like that. And that's a modified talking head format. You just have lots of talking heads and you go back and forth and then it's the interaction. If you like what they're talking about, some of those those are fairly popular, but not as popular as, for example, 60 Minutes was for years the #1 TV show in America. And what it was it was just a series of news stories, but done in depth, a lot of visuals, kind of like the Pulitzer type stories, but more related just to America, stories that people didn't know very much about, where they could go in some detail, and lots of good visuals as well as good interviews. But they're the first ones in America that really made news interesting. Like it became the number one TV show, Sunday night TV show, most popular in America, because they knew how to tell a story. And so other of the TV networks tried to copy them and so forth, and there were other ones that were pretty popular too. But you needed to tell a story, and it wasn't talking heads. Um, it was getting out and getting more visuals. So what's B-roll? She said you never have enough B-roll. What's B-roll? Anybody? Nobody? B-roll is kind of like background video. And so you take lots of background video. You saw a lot of it on here. So while you're telling the story, you see the flooding, you see all this sort of stuff in the background. It's not really part of the interview per se, but you're seeing all the background and stuff going on that makes the story more interesting. And so you never have enough B-roll, was what she said. Lots of, gives you a lot of the environment, so to speak, of this story, the setting of the story. What'd she say about the interview itself? Just stand there and talk to the camera? What did she say you should be doing besides standing there and talking to the camera? Is get your interviewer away from, out visiting the prison, visiting the disaster site, whatever, so in that case, you might start off with the headshot, with the talking head, but then you hear the interview as the whoever is walking along showing what's happening. So in some cases, you're not seeing his mouth move because he's not, so you're hearing his interview as he's showing you the problem, as he's demonstrating the problem. So you get him away from the talking head situation and show the background. So the visuals, when you think about visuals, whether it's print or whether it's a video, think about how powerful that imagery can be, that visual can be, whether it's a photograph or it's video. It's the same principle, basically. You want to get away from the talking heads. What I used to do, what I hate above all, is the photograph of somebody smiling at the camera. I hate that. So when I would start a new job, or start a new newspaper or take over a new newspaper or something, the first thing I would do is to go to all the important meetings because I knew I'd have to cover the meetings, and I would just take pictures of all the public officials at these meetings. And so I'd come away with, in the first week, I would have, well over 100 photos. And I would not ask anybody to pose for a photo. That's exactly the photo I would not take. So if they're in a city council meeting, I'd be taking of them, talking and expressing themselves and angry and happy and whatever it is they might be, as many emotions that I could find to put into my file for when I had a story about them and could not go take their photo. And so even a photo of a head and shoulders, there's a big difference between the head and shoulders of somebody, and they're talking about something very serious and there they are. It doesn't match the story at all, and it's a boring photo anyway. But if they show some intensity, if they show some expression, now even just a head and shoulder shot can have some feeling to it, some emotion to it. And so I never, ever, except by command, basically, and that was more in a PR situation, would ever take a photo of somebody smiling at a camera. Or at least I'd have no intention of actually running it. I might take it, but I wouldn't use it because it does not express emotion, does not express feeling, it does not tell the story. And so, no smiling photos, by my opinion, anyway, as an editor and as a longtime journalist, no smiling photos. I mean, no smiling at the camera, stage photos. I a little bit, some professional news photographers still stage photos. I try to avoid that as much as possible. Consequently, when I I'm not sure if I can find it here real quick. I'll probably have an example of some in here, but when I go to a conference, for example, conferences can be very boring. A lot of talking heads. I'm not taking any pictures of people smiling at the camera. No way. I will take them of them, explaining something at in a breakout session or whatever. But I am looking for that moment to get that front page story. This was, I'm thinking, particularly when I was working for the state of Washington. So it was actually a PR job. I was producing a publication, a bilingual publication about migrant education. So it was a PR job, but even as a PR person, I do not want smiling photos at the camera. I want, because PR is no good if people don't read your story. And so if you take photos that are boring, nobody's going to read your story, whether it's PR or news. And so one of the mistakes that PR people make is to think it doesn't matter. So they take smiling photos of their boss or whatever, and they're defeating the purpose. Because even if it's a company-owned publication, nobody wants to see somebody just smiling at the camera when the option is somebody doing something. When they're maybe out going through the production plant, or in the case of migrant education, the classroom teaching or something like that, working with a child, showing them how to do something. I mean, there are much better photos than somebody smiling at the camera. And so PR people who don't understand that are bad PR people. They don't understand they're supposedly trying to write stories that will be printed in the newspaper or put on TV. And if they're sending them photos like that, that will not capture anybody's attention. Nobody's going to be excited about that. So even if you're a PR person, you need to think like a news person. And so many of the top PR organizations, whether they're captive for like for example, the head of PR for a bank in Kazakhstan, I got to know pretty well. And so as the top head of PR, she was in charge of public communications. She was also in charge of employee communications. She was also in charge of investor communications for the bank. So she had to hire people for all those positions, and also, I guess, government communications. So sometimes they had to communicate with the government. Well, those are totally different stories you're going to be telling. But if you're telling the story to the public, you're trying to get newspapers to run it, she would not hire anybody for that job who had not actually worked for the media, because they didn't know how to they didn't know how to do it. They may have learned how to write in college. They may have learned how to take a photo in college, but they didn't yet understand what an editor would want, because they'd never worked for an editor. And so she would not hire anybody in the public communication part of her job who had not worked under a good professional editor or TV director or whatever. Okay, so again, the visuals that she was talking about is get away from the talking head, get the stuff that's interesting as much, give people as much of an image of what your story is about as possible. Tell it in photos. One of the things she said for video is how could you, but it's true, I think, in some ways, to a lesser degree, but to some ways with a print story too. Think about doing visuals as if there was going to be no story with it. How could you tell the story just with photos and captions, video without any talking head? Because if you have those visuals, now your story is going to be much stronger with it, whether it's a video story or a print story. Think about how you can tell your story in visuals, and then you'll be a good journalist, whether it's print journalist or other. So those are some things I hope that you would understand from that video. Very short video, but I think covers a lot of key things that will help you be successful in communications, whether it's PR, video journalism, print journalism. They all, as I said, that's what I try to teach the NGOs, how to tell their story better. Because if they told their story better, all those NGOs across Central Asia, if they tell their story better, they'll get more money from the donors. They'll get more support from the community. They'll get published in the newspapers and in magazines and be on TV. There's all sorts of things that knowing how to tell your story better is valuable to anybody who has an idea to sell or a story to tell. And so it can be an NGO, it can be a business, it can be a school, it can be everybody needs to tell their story better. And so anyway, so I want to talk a little bit about news writing because that's your first it's your second project. For some of you, it'll be the first one you complete. Some of it will not, and we'll come back here to the presentations in just a second. But let me just go a little bit over news writing. I did write a textbook on this, and I posted an excerpt from it on Moodle. Basically, I kind of said here, what I intended to say here is what I've said just now. Is everybody needs to learn how to write journalistically and to tell their story journalistically. I mentioned how I was published, in a journal when I was just a couple of months into my master's program, because I told the story effectively, like a journalist would. And I was very surprised that the editor of that journal would push aside all the articles from the PhDs because they knew how to write academies and I didn't. But what I learned from that is that the editor didn't want me to write in academies. He liked my journalese, so to speak. So that's why I try to do it even with my academic writing. There are three basic principles in writing effectively. One, I say organize to emphasize. The very first thing you need to do, in fact, you actually do it as you're interviewing. So as you're interviewing and asking people questions, you need to be cognizant of how you're going to use the information. You should never, in my success strategies class, I teach the principles of Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. One of his 7 habits is begin with the end in mind. You should do that as a journalist. Begin with the end in mind. And throughout your journalism, throughout your interview, you need to be thinking of the end you have in mind. And so you may go in. I mentioned before there were some interviews, long interviews over lunch and stuff, where I had no idea what the end story was going to be. Well, what did that mean? I mean, during my interview, I had to figure that out. And so as we talked casually, I had to figure out, bam, there it is. That's the story I'm going to tell, and follow up and give follow-up questions as soon as I found my whammy, what I call a whammy. And so if you have no idea what your story is going to be about, you're going to be talking kind of generally, kind of hitting all over the place until, bam, the light goes off. There it is. That's my story. And then you pursue that story with your questions. Even if you have a pretty good idea, you go in and you may think you know what the story is going to be when you come out of it, but you may not. I was talking about 60 Minutes, and I wrote an anti-60 Minutes story once. Not really anti, it was kind of anti. They had told a story about my community, something that was happening in my community, and they had done a hit job on it. They really made my community look bad. And I knew it was wrong. I just didn't know how they got it wrong. Well, what happened here? And so, without going into all the details, I had to go investigate and redo their story, in essence, to find out how did they get so screwed up. Here this was, the #1 TV program in the world, saying my community stunk. And they were wrong. I knew that. But how in the world did they get so screwed up? And so I had to do a lot of interviewing, and it turned out to be one person in my community was saying that the major church in the community had tried to put him out of business, and he was suing that church for $50 million for putting him out of business. But when I finally got, as I started going around, I started asking a number of people, first, not him, other people, to try to get out, who is this person? What's he like? What's going on here? And his brother-in-law told me he's crazy. Um, he owed a lot of money to a lot of people, and the bank in my community, the bank president had gone to basically say, you need, I'm not going to extend your loan. You need to either come pay me, come pay it off, go find another bank to pick up your loan and pay me off, or I'm going to take your farm from you, your orchard and your packing plant is what he was running. And as he was walking to the man's house, his car blew up behind him. So now we're talking about somebody who, was that by accident? Your car just accidentally blew up, coincidentally, in the guy's yard. Um, so that was part of the story. Was this guy really crazy? I was talking to people around. I was talking to that bank president and so forth, and I'll come back to him some other time. But ultimately, I wanted to talk to him. I was a little bit scared. If he was blowing up people's cars, what would he do to me? But but again, he had somehow convinced 60 Minutes that our community and the church that dominated our community had really done him wrong, had purposely gone out to put him out of business. So I sat down, I just started talking to him, and one subject that we will talk about is whether or not to record your interviews, even in a belligerent situation. Now, some journalists, there's a wide range of opinion on this. One award-winning journalist with the New York Times that I interviewed uh, never recorded anything. In fact, not only did not record it, he never took notes in front of his, well, at least not against his, not with his important, with his key, um, the subject of his story. But the reason was he was putting people in prison. He was interviewing people that had broken the law. And so he felt like he had to go talk to them face to face, maintain eye contact the whole time, and didn't want them thinking that, be conscious of him taking notes, and say, yeah, I'm putting you in jail, buddy. So he would not only not record it, he would not even take notes in front of them. As soon as he was done with the interview, he'd run out into the stairwell or whatever, find a private place and write his notes from memory. That's the one extreme. Okay, that I don't recommend that for most journalists because you're not going to come out with hardly any direct quotes from that because your memory isn't good enough to come out with an accurate direct quote. So that's kind of contrary to my opinion. In fact, that is contrary to my experience. I mentioned two mayors have been removed from office, and I had the recorder running in front of them. I had it running right in front of them. And actually what I found was turning on the recorder allowed me to have eye contact with them. Plus they didn't think, and I didn't know going into either of those interviews that it was going to turn out into something controversial. I didn't know that. And so, I turned on the recorder and we had a conversation. I maintained eye contact. I took a few notes. When I turn on a recorder, I take notes as kind of my table of contents. I now know in what order to ask questions, and so I can go back to the recorder. And if something goes wrong with the recorder, I have some notes and my memory to write the story. And that has happened. You can't always trust recorders, so you do have to have Plan B, which is take enough notes and find out immediately when you're done if it recorded correctly, so that you still have some memory of other things they said that you didn't get recorded. But so if I use a recorder, and I found the recorder has been extremely helpful to me, especially in controversial stories. So in both cases, both mayors tried to say I lied in my story. And in both cases, I said, anybody's welcome to come listen to the recording. And so I had the recording to back me up. Now, in this day and age, another public official did the same thing. In that case, I just put the recording on the internet. I said, anybody in the community want to know she's a liar? Here's the whole interview. I like recorders, and I have not found them to inhibit anybody from being an idiot. And people, in this case of this orchardist, I sat down with him and I turned on the recorder and I just, we had a nice, I could maintain eye contact with him. We had a nice conversation and I got the whole story, which basically admitted the only reason why he even included the church in the lawsuit was that was the only small chance he had of getting his farm back. But actually, the church had done him a favor. The bank had foreclosed on him, and they invited the church to come and bid on his farm and on his packing plant as part of its welfare system to help people in the community. And the church really didn't want to buy it, but they finally agreed, we'll come and think about it. So they sent somebody to the auction. At that point, it had gone to an auction. And the minimum bid was whatever he owed to the bank. So if nobody offered any more than that, all they had to do was pay off his bank loan and they would have his farm, his orchard, and his packing plant. And so nobody else would bid on it. And the church said, I'll tell you what, it can be an important part of our mission, of our welfare program. So we will pay you $50,000 up front, and this was in 1978 money. So $100,000 was a lot of money in those days. We'll pay you $50,000 today. We'll pay off the loan. We'll pay you another $50,000 when you vacate the premises. And so in other words, they were paying him $100,000. They didn't have to pay him one penny. All they had to do was pay off the bank loan. And so they were hardly his enemy. They did him a tremendous favor, and so he took the first $50,000 and went and hired a lawyer and sued them. So, because it was a very tenuous connection to the church at all. But anyway, so he ultimately told me his whole story, and it was all on video, all on recording. The interesting part was the bank president. When I called the bank president, I also record telephone conversations. And so I turned on my recorder that I attached to my phone and called him up, and he was probably like the most highly respected person in the city. He was the owner of the name of the city was American Fork, and he was of the Bank of American Fork, the oldest bank, the biggest bank, the strongest bank, and he was a leader in the church. He was the leader of the community. A very proud man. And so I called him up, and this is another important lesson to you. And I turned on my recorder, and he immediately said, I explained what I wanted, that, I'd been told that his car had been blown up when he went to serve papers on this orchardist, and I was writing a story about it. And he said, I'm not going to talk about it. Anyway, he talked for about, 5 seconds, and then he hung up on me. So, first off, item one, when somebody says they're not going to talk to you and they start talking, even 10 seconds of quotable material can be important. 10 seconds is actually quite a few words. And if they talk a little longer than that, if they talk to you, if they say they're not going to talk to you and they talk 30 seconds, that's almost a whole interview of material. I mean, that's a lot of material. 30 seconds is a lot of material. And so if you've recorded it and you can use, just because they said they're not going to talk to you doesn't mean you can't use what they say, because they said it. And you told them you're a journalist. They know you're a journalist. So you have whatever they tell you, you can now use. He did say a little bit, but mainly I said he refused to comment. That was it. He refused to comment. When the story, instead of being happy about the story, that I had cleared that I had defended the community and defended the majority church there, and told the real story about this guy, where he was coming from, the bank president was mad at me. He came into my office, and I remember he came into my office and he kind of backed me in the corner, and he's a little German guy. He's only about this tall, and he started pounding on my chest and saying, you did not give me a chance to answer your questions. I said, I certainly did. And he said, no, you didn't. I said, well, I did, and I had it on recording. You have a recording? Let me hear the recording. So I played the recording for him, and it showed that he was very abrupt and very, I don't know, that'd give him plenty of chance anyway. And so then he went to and tried to get me arrested for wiretapping. Uh, because he had his, I don't know, because he thought it made him look bad that he refused to comment. The one thing you need to understand as a journalist and as an interviewer, first off, uh, whether or not you're doing something illegal. In Utah, it was not. In some states, it would have been wiretapping. So every state is different in America. Every state has its own laws. Utah is in Utah, and Utah said it's okay as long as one person in the conversation knew. And so I was not sent to prison for it. Um, but he still was a person I didn't want to have it as an enemy in that community, for sure. I probably could have handled that better. I probably could have sat down with them and apologized. I don't know what for, but maybe had given him a chance, like I did in some other stories similar to that, and said, "Well, why don't we do another story?" And you can tell our readers whatever you want to tell them, whatever. And maybe that would have handled the situation better. I didn't do that. But anyway, what you normally find is your truest stories are the one people will deny. It's not the ones you do a mistake on. That's hardly ever. You hardly ever get in trouble for stories you make a mistake on. Although try never to make mistakes. But the ones most likely to get you in trouble are the ones you've done perfectly. Because it's the truth. And the people who are maddest at you are the ones about whom you told the truth. If you've made a mistake, then that's easy to get out of that, you know. Okay, we'll do a retraction, whatever. But if you told the truth, now that's a problem. So be aware of that. That's one reason I like recordings, and I've never had a problem using a recorder. But again, be ready to back it up. Be ready to take some notes. Check your recording afterwards. Make sure it recorded okay. If not, sit down like the New York Times reporter and write down everything you can possibly remember, so you still write a story. You don't want to be embarrassed and have to go back and ask to redo the interview. You might do some sort of form of that. You might say, "Oh, I had a few additional questions I wanted to ask," and ask a few additional questions. Maybe in this day and age, as I mentioned, it could be by email even. So you screw up your personal interview, so you say, "I had a few extra questions for you," and you send them an email or whatever and get some more quotes from them. But anyway, that's like I say. I have one book that they recommended for our class. Almost the whole book is about how to handle recordings and quoting and stuff. It's kind of a stupid book, so I'm not going to use that one. But the basics is there's lots of opinions on it. I do use a recorder, and I've never had a problem using it. In fact, it's like I say, it's helped me many times to have that recording. Eye contact is important, and so it actually helps you to have eye contact if you have a recorder going and the person you're interviewing. In most cases, unless they're a criminal, in that case they may not want to talk to you at all. But if they're a criminal, then that's a different situation. So there's reasons why the New York Times reporter did not only not use a recorder, but did not even take notes. He was interviewing criminals. And I'll talk some more about his approach, because he had a very interesting approach to where one person he put into prison sends them a Christmas card every week. He thinks they're friends. Anyway, so he has an interesting approach to putting people in prison. But there's lots of reasons, lots of cautions when it comes to using a tape recorder, and there are situations where obviously it's not a good idea. But I've actually never been in that situation. I can't think of a situation where I thought, oh, I dare not take a tape recorder with me. Okay. So getting through the first bullet item here. Thank you. Great for my audio. So I'm looking, even from the very start of the interview, I'm looking for the whamming. Now, if I haven't decided by the end of the interview, then certainly going through my notes, I am looking for the whammy. I'm looking for the thing I'm going to focus my story on. And so, yes, I need to think about it while I'm interviewing. I need to think about it immediately afterwards, because your whammy is what you emphasize in your lead. That's the thing you're going to emphasize in the lead, and then kind of build from that from your story in the rest of your story. So you're looking about that element that's going to catch people's attention. That's your whammy. That becomes the focus of your lead, and leads the rest of your story in that inverted pyramid we talked about. So the inverted pyramid, again, if it's you're kind of starting with the lead. I mentioned last week about the complete lead is paragraph 1 and 2 and maybe 3. So it's basically your summary, the telling your story, kind of like your first 3 paragraphs or so might be more or less what you would write for a radio news story. Radio news stories are always very short, almost always very short. And so you can almost think of, I just told my story, my first 3 paragraphs, I told my whole story, and now you start over and tell the rest of your story for print, because print gives you more room than any other medium. Well, print, text, but the internet obviously has limitless room, uh, even though they like short stories on the internet. Um, you can have lots of associated stories, and you can tell, and you can do like I did, and put an entire interview on the internet, but not expect maybe anybody to listen to it. But you can link it to your story. So there's lots of things you can do on the internet you can't do in print either. But as far as the traditional media, print has the most space to tell a story. The entire newscast, the typical newscast of about 30 minutes in America, is equivalent more or less to the front page of a newspaper. That's how much news the TV can handle. And so if you have a 50-page newspaper or whatever, that's 50 times as much as the TV is going to give you. And so it's tells more of the story and more stories than the other media, not called the internet. Um, we'll come back to the inverted pyramid later. Simplify to clarify. We talked about that a little bit already. Simple, simple, simple. Don't try to use a long word when you can use a short word. Don't try to use a long sentence when you can use a short sentence. Don't try to use a long paragraph when you can make shorter paragraphs. Everything should be simple. That's how I wrote that journal article. So even academics like it, but that is the key to successful journalism. You're shooting at like the 8th grade level, and even the people with PhD can skim it faster, and so they can get through more stories, and it's more profitable to them if you've written simply. And so write simplify to clarify. And finally, attribute to verify. Uh, essentially everything should be attributed. There should be no question where you got any information. That's one thing, like I said, that I really hate about the American media right now, and it's reporting on Donald Trump, anonymous sources all over the places. And it's become obvious from the recent Mueller report that was released. A lot of the people who were, who they proclaimed as being really good sources were liars. Because if they were telling the truth, then Trump would be indicted by now. And so all these people that were telling stories in the New York Times was printing them, and the Washington Post was printing them, were manipulating the press, and they were happily going along with it because they were supposedly highly ranked officials or had some expertise or whatever, and they're being used by their sources. And so that's one reason why you want to force them to be named if possible. It isn't always possible. I know that, and I've used anonymous sources before. But first off, I think I mentioned before, the policy has been at most big news organizations that at least your editor has to know who that source was. So you don't have just one person making stuff up, because that does occur sometimes. Sometimes they do just make stuff up. That's the first defense against bad journalism is the editor has to know everything. No anonymity that the editor doesn't know. But then beyond it, the editor can still be sucked in if the people have motivation to tell a lie and they're willing to face it later, because the newspaper can't do anything about it. They can't throw them in jail for somebody lying to them. And so if it's important to them to tell a bad story about somebody, then the only defense is a lawsuit, and that is the president in America cannot sue for anything. The more famous you are and the more you want attention, the less the courts give you the opportunity to sue somebody for libel or invasion of privacy or anything like that in America. I know it's just the opposite in most countries. The people in power are the ones that are most protected, not in America. The courts have made it so that the famous people can rarely successfully sue anybody for saying bad things about them or attributing misinformation to them or whatever else, and the president is right at the top of that list. He has no defense. So anybody who wants to lie about him can get away with it in America. He has no defense. Okay, so we talked about some news values, and I told you my news values are a little bit different than what you see in other textbooks. My number one is consequence. And I make that my number one because that is why somebody reads a newspaper. Is almost especially a newspaper. They read other things for other reasons, but a newspaper is almost always the first reason why people read the newspaper is for consequence, how something's going to affect them, and that's why that accident that killed 5 people locally is more important than the whatever happened in Great Britain that killed 50 people, because 5 people in my community have consequence to me, and 50 people in Great Britain don't, and 1,000 people in Africa don't. Not to me personally. And so that those 5 people who die in my community have consequences. Why did they die? What happened? Was there a drunk driver that I need to be afraid of? Was there something bad with the roads? Was it icy roads? Why did 5 people die in a car accident in my little community? And so consequence is always number one. Now, then after that, you can go to curiosity. And so then, there's the curiosity about lots of different things like sports. Maybe that's consequence too to some people. If they take sports seriously enough, I guess it's consequence. Did my team win? Please, did my team win? To them, that's consequence. But it's also, for others, it may just be curiosity. But they know it's not that important. Suspense. If you have a story with suspense, now truthfully, there are not enough suspense stories in news. There's not enough of them. I put it number 3, knowing that it is not, that news value is not used enough. You want suspense if you can. And so if you can tell a story, a crime story or something with some suspense in it, that's great. Find that story. So I put it up there knowing that there are very few suspense stories in news. But if you can create that story, some of the great, there have been movies made out of short news stories. I can't remember the name, which one it was, but I know there was when I was working in Buffalo, somebody was telling me about a news story that was only that long that became a best-selling movie. I can't remember what it was, but anyway, so the news writer did not do a very good job if his story was that long, and it was good enough information that somebody else made a movie out of it. Obviously, the reporter didn't do a good job. Because there was a lot of more potential to that story, obviously. Truman Capote was a Pulitzer Prize winning author, and he delved into the area of kind of what we might call new journalism. And so one of the most famous books was called In Cold Blood. In Cold Blood was a story about the murder of a family, I think of 5 people out in the rural area of Kansas or someplace. And basically, it started with a small news story. But it was interesting to him, and he went in and he interviewed everybody. He went in depth in it. His book is that thick, so he made it. It's like a 700-page book that he wrote all about what started as a news story. But he went in and he was able to interview. He was able to go into the prison and interview the killer. He was the first one where I think that the killer actually confessed was to him. although he had already been put in prison. They had enough evidence to put him in prison, but he had never admitted to doing it until Capote came along and he thought, gee, that could well be in a book. And so he told him the whole story. So he got all the grisly details, told the background information of the family and got you loving the family, and then this guy coming in and the murder and the cover up and the investigation, all this into a best-selling book in cold blood. So, the potential, there's lots of stories that have far more potential than journalists take advantage of. That's one of the things I think I kind of mentioned before. It was that first job I had when I first went to Tampa, Florida. Uh, I was not the editor day one, although I'd been hired to be the editor day one. The guy that hired me, paid me what said he'd pay me, but he had actually hired somebody else to be editor, knowing he was going to fire that guy. Again, a problem of ethics of that company. But anyway, so he hired somebody else who was a good professional as editor, knowing that he was going to bring me in to replace him. And so the guy they did have in there was a good experienced journalist who taught me a lot in the few months I worked under him before I took over. But we also again had a very small staff, and so in some cases um, he had me rewrite stories that were already in the daily newspaper. To go, this kind of he went around looking for the Truman Capote sort of story. Maybe not quite that good a one, but I said, okay, here's a story. Find out more about this and write about it. And so what I found, that's where I first realized, or maybe not first realized, but at least it helped me realize how badly most reporters do their job. And so, for example, I take a story about a fire, and I go through all that story, and again, in the daily newspaper, they were doing it quickly, and they would ask the who, what, when, where, no why, no how. And so I would go in and I would make that phone call if I was in a hurry, talk to the fire chief or whatever, find out if there was arson to it, find out what happened, get some more details, ask how it happened, get them to describe it to me. How did they react? What were the challenges of the fire? Um, anyway, so forth. So I'd pursue particularly the how and why questions with those stories and turn, a short story in the daily newspaper into a longer story with more detail and make it more interesting. Find a better whammy to it than what they gave to it. They just kind of kissed it off. They didn't think it was important, but there was a story within that story that they hadn't covered yet. Okay, going back to the news values, pathos, love, humor. These are kind of separate, but at the same time, they are not what you normally think of as news values. They would not be included in most lists of news values. But pathos or love, like a story about a little child that you can empathize with, that maybe has cancer or whatever, story about an animal that was injured and people are taking care of it, trying to, these are pathos, love sort of stories that are not that are really good stories. People are interested in those things. What happens? I mean, I wrote this book long before the World Wide Web and before all this stuff was going viral on YouTube and stuff. What are some of the stuff going viral? Silly videos about animals. I put one on that got a lot of on Facebook. A video where this dog was I think it was a dog was its tail was wagging back and forth, and there's this tiny, I think it was a cat, a little kitten, was kind of grabbing in his tail, and finally grabbed the tail, and the little kitten was being wagged back and forth by this dog. It goes viral. It's a silly story, right? But so that proved my point. Before the World Wide Web, I said these things are interesting to people. Indeed, that stuff is going viral now in the internet. So if you find something with a humorous angle, a pathos angle, a love angle, those are good stories. Timeliness and proximity. Something that happens now is more important than something that happened 50 years ago, obviously. But that doesn't mean you can't find something relevant in a new story about something old. If they find out here in Malaysia a crashed World War II bomber, for example. It ties back to history, but they just found it. So you can tie together something current to something past, many, decades ago. Um, it also, by the way, many stories require follow-ups, especially in the newspaper. You have enough space to do follow-ups. And so very frequently, those who win the top prize in America, the Pulitzer Prize, have not just written one story. They've written a series of stories. I have a video. I may have you listen to it or assign it as homework or something. But I did an interview of somebody from a newspaper close to where I live in America, the Oregonian, who did a series of stories about a man from this part of the world, actually. I can't remember, Japanese, Chinese, I don't know, in this part of the world. But he was living in San Francisco, and he had visited somebody in Oregon, and then he was heading back to San Francisco, and he disappeared. Him and his family, wife and 2 children. Nobody knew where they were. And so this became an ongoing series of stories, and it turned out he tried to take a shortcut, and he got up into the mountains and got snowbound. He tried to walk out. He died trying to walk out and save his family. Um, I don't remember all the other details right now. I'm not sure. Maybe one of the children died too. I forget now. But they ultimately, the search finally, they used some new techniques to find these people, and ended up setting up a whole new system there of people, even though they're outside of cellular range, and mobile phone range, there is a way of detecting whether somebody's trying to call from that sort of a location. And so they set up a whole new system for emergency purposes. If somebody gets lost and they think they may have gotten up into the mountains and outside of normal mobile range, they can maybe track them down with from where their mobile devices were and so forth. And so this went follow up by follow up, and they won the top prize in America with that series of stories. Um, and that, by the way, also has suspense to it and so forth as they develop the story, and they're hoping to find the family alive. And they did find some of them alive, and the dad dead at least. I can't remember about one of the children. Um, anyway, so timeliness is kind of an evolving thing. And so with this story, the stories evolved as they proceeded, and so they had to emphasize the most timely information as they wrote this series of stories. You don't start if you don't on day 5 retell. Well, you have to include some of the information from the day 1 story. You have some information that maybe needs to go into the day 5 story, but you don't lead with it. You can't have that be your whammy. That's now old news. That's 5 days old. Now, day 5, you have to find a new angle. You have to find a new whammy to it. And so you can do a series of stories, and every time timeliness becomes the consideration. What is the most recent information that we can emphasize in the story? So timeliness is very important. And that's one reason, again, I did tell you that in competing with daily papers, I had to be timeless. I had to write my stories as if they had no time element at all. I was covering issues. I wasn't covering events. I was covering issues. And issues have no timeliness element. So I eliminated the when. Gone. Now I was covering issues. Proximity, we already talked about that. Cultural proximity as well as geographic. We normally think of that as geographic, and it normally is. But there is this cultural proximity that we were talking about also. Achievement, again, if somebody in your community wins some top award for something, you're going to cover that. May have a little bit of consequence to it, proximity to it, whatever. Or it could be something like the Olympics. Okay, now everything that the athletes from your country accomplish at the Olympics is newsworthy.
Feature writing. Someone who achieved something.
Is what now?
Feature writing.
Feature writing. Yeah. Yes, that's achievement would be if you're taking a feature writing class. Um, that's one thing you're looking for. You're looking for prominence and achievement. That's kind of those your feature writing is normally down there. It doesn't have to be. I mean, a good feature story may have consequence, may have lots of those other elements to it. And so I would consider all of those elements in looking for a good feature story. Some of that humor, love, pathos may be part of your feature story. Um, but it may just, I mean, if you're just going into it and you're saying, well, I've got to do this feature story, maybe I can talk to, the assistant president or whatever, that she's got prominence. Okay, so you start there. Hopefully you can find something more important than prominence, although well, there is. She's got consequence. Okay, so there's almost always some other element besides just prominence. Um, and just achievement. There's other elements you're looking for to make it a better story. But I actually put those down towards the bottom because I mean, they're all important, but I'm really looking for those top ones. I'm looking for the consequence. I am looking to find stuff that other people don't know that's touching their curiosity. If I can find some suspense to the story, that's great. I mean, I'm just looking for all that stuff. They're all in consideration when I'm deciding what to ask, what to put on the front page, how to judge a story compared to other stories as an editor, for example. Okay, we already talked about the 5 Ws and my emphasis of the why and how. And we also talked about attribute essentially everything. Everything has a source. In practical purposes, as far as uh, I mean, there's a fine line. There may be some things that you don't need to attribute, as I mentioned. Possibly in paragraph 2, you're summing up a bunch of 5 Ws about where it happened and so forth. And that's so obvious that, yeah, you really need an attribution to the fact that we had a conference here on campus. You know it happened. Uh, Probably other people were aware of it also. There's no credibility question to it. Somebody lying to us that there really was a conference here on campus. So maybe you don't need an attribution to some of that information that is so obvious, so obviously true, so unquestionable that you can state it as fact without an attribution. That's probably in paragraph, particularly in paragraph 2, you find that situation. Um, as you get into it, though, be very conscious of attribution as your source of credibility. And so you don't want to have any question as to where information is coming from. That's, like I say, totally to do with credibility. So I kind of went back. I already talked about these as we saw it in the previously in the previous slide. I'm just going to flip through these. Here is the inverted pyramid. So let me talk about that just a little bit more. We already talked about how it was created during the Civil War when telegraph lines were being blown up, and so they said, send us the most important stuff first, and lo and behold, they found out that the readers liked it better that way also. And so that's the dominant form in America anyway, is the inverted pyramid. Give the most interesting stuff first, starting with the whammy. We're going to emphasize the whammy, what I call the whammy, so others call the hook. You're hooking people into your story. There's various terms for it. You're looking for what's going to get people to read the story, and that goes into the lead. The complete lead, again, is paragraph 1 and 2, might be 3 and 4, might even be more. Particularly if you're using the Wall Street Journal approach I was talking about earlier, and you're telling the story of a family, and then you're going to go into the statistical information. Well, maybe you're telling that story about that family. The whole story is maybe basically your lead. You're sucking people into the story with in your news story with the example story of this family and what they're experiencing. So in essence, they become your lead. And so the rest of the story is all statistics and stuff. So you start off with that story, and that maybe, like I say, might be 4 or 5 paragraphs long, and it's all really your complete lead. So it is possible to have a complete lead that's quite a bit longer than 2 paragraphs, and especially with that sort of descriptive of lead. Um, then after your lead comes the body of the story. And um, the first paragraph after your complete lead is called the bridge. What do you suppose the bridge does? Actually, it probably says up there. No, it doesn't really. But what do you suppose? What does that word mean, and what would it mean in this context? What would be a bridge in this context? What do you think? Well, it's obviously that the idea is it's taking you to a new part of the story. Well, what do you need to do? Why do you need a bridge? To make them connect. You're connecting, that's a bridge. You're connecting two things. Um, and so I told you a second ago that your complete lead is kind of like your radio story, right? You just summarize your whole story, and that's all that's used on a radio news story. So now you just told the whole story. Why do you need the rest of it? So the best way, you're needing some transition, you need to tie them together. You just told the summary of your story. Now you need to tie it, you need to link into the body of your story, and it needs to flow well. It needs to transition well. And so what I frequently do, especially in an interview story, so pay attention. In an interview story, what I'm doing is I'm looking for the whammy in my interview, and I'm not using it as a direct quote in the lead. I'm not using it as a direct quote in the lead. Most editors do not want direct quote leads, period. So you first off, at least not in America, and I can only extrapolate from there. But they don't want a direct quote in the lead. It's usually because you can say it simpler and easier in your own words. In other words, rather than using a direct quote, you use an indirect quote for your lead. So what's that leave you? That leaves you a really good direct quote. And where's a good place to use it? Ta-da! The bridge. And so if you find your best direct quote and you summarize, you put it into your words in a real concise, powerful way, and make that your lead, now you have the complete direct quote for your bridge. And what it does, it brings you right back to the start of the story again. So now you start your story again and you start giving the details in the body of your story. That's a perfect transition when you have a story based on interview. Is use the indirect quote for the lead, use the direct quote for typically paragraph 3. Now you're coming right back to the start of the story, and you can start now all the details of your story. So consequently, when both of those examples I gave you, I think I have to go back to them, used an indirect quote as the lead. They may not have. I don't know whether paragraph 3 was a direct quote. I don't always use paragraph 3 as my direct quote, but it is a very quick way. A journalist has to learn how to write very quickly. As an example, as an editor of the daily newspaper, it was right around midnight. All the news reporters had gone home by about 9 or 10 o'clock. They were home. And we turn on we can hear the police talking to each other in what's called a police scanner. And so we're listening to police scanner as we're actually just finishing our pages. All of our pages are now done. 12 was our midnight. Midnight was our deadline to paginate our pages, prepare them to go to press. And across the radio is kind of what I was talking about before. A car had driven off, had gone across the bridge and onto an island, and then went right off the island into the river. And 5 people were in the car, and it was sinking into the river. Well, we needed that story, and so what we do is, they have to go ahead. They have to get the newspaper going, and if necessary, go without that story in order to get to all of their readers. They had about 50,000 readers, and some of them were 100 miles away. And so they have to start shipping newspapers out to those people 100 miles away as soon as possible to get them there, because then they send them out in trucks, Then they give them to, usually in America, a daily newspaper is delivered to the doorstep by usually a teenager, a young teenager. By the time they get older, they don't want to do it anymore. They really don't make very much money, and so older teenagers doesn't want to do it unless they're desperate for money. Maybe some retirees do it, but mostly like 12-year-old kids are delivering newspapers to the doorstep of people in their neighborhood, and then they have to go back and collect the money for their monthly subscription later. Um, so um, so consequently, you have these deadlines for delivery. They have to be delivered to the carriers, to these kids, by 6 in the morning, at least. It has to be sitting uh, on their doorstep, the whole bundle of papers they're going to deliver at least by 6. And so everything you backtrack from there, by 2 in the morning, the press has to be running. And between 12 and 2, they're making the plates, they're doing all the stuff in preparation to start the printing. So anyway, I go out to the island to do the story. Um, First off, there's the ethical conflict here that's going on in my head and in my heart, is that nobody would go into the water. Um, and I wanted to, and I asked people, no, you can't go in. What if you get down there? That right now, if the windows didn't break, there may be a bubble of air in that car. You go down and open a door or something, you're going to kill them. You cannot go into the water. So they had a search and rescue team that was supposed to be coming, scuba divers. They were supposed to come and rescue them. 30 minutes passed, 40 minutes passed. And I'm thinking, why the heck didn't I dive in that water already? Because, 40 minutes later, these people, even if no window broke, there's going to be water seeping in. These people are probably all dead by now. But there were police officers there, and obviously, and I still ponder. I mean, maybe I could have dived in and just looked. What's going on here? If a window had already broken, then there'd be no reason not to go try to save, get people out as soon as possible. Maybe somebody would survive. Anyway, so as a journalist, though, I was stuck on the shore waiting for the scuba divers to come and pull out the bodies. They still sent them to the hospital. Ultimately, they were all dead. So I got what I could from the scene, and it was already like, I think, 1 o'clock or something. So I'd been there like an hour. Got to the office, and so they wanted to chase the story. And that means they're going to stop the press, and I had 10 minutes to write the story. So while I was starting to write the story based on what the information I had, some other editors were calling the hospital to find out their status, if they could find out if how many people if they knew they were dead, if they didn't know if there were people still they thought might survive or whatever, they could find out. And so in 15 minutes away, we had to have that to the press, remake the front plate. It went on the bottom of the front page. Another story, an AP story got pulled out. Associated Press story, a Wire story got pulled out. My story went in. And so the rest of the papers closest to home did get that story. The ones I said, the other ones didn't get that story because it was too late to get to them. So there are times when you got 10 minutes to write a story. That's going to be on the front page. So you have to figure out how to write a story, a strategy for writing a story quickly. So that's exactly the sort of thing I'm teaching you right now. Look for the whammy, write your lead. Probably of those 10 minutes, 5 minutes were taken for the lead. I had to have the perfect lead, and then the other stories had to be done double time. The rest of the paragraphs. So it ended up being like a 20-paragraph story, one paragraph, 5 minutes, 19 paragraphs in 5 minutes. A very quick writing. Okay, so anyway, it's a good formula to understand, especially interview-based stories. Find your best quote, summarize it, make it an indirect quote for your lead, make it your bridge for the rest of your story after you use paragraph 2 to summarize the story. And one thing I say about Whamming is you need to understand, as I was telling you about my work in Tampa and other places too, how do I compete with established daily newspapers who had been there for maybe a century in many cases, or close to a century? How do I steal their readership? I have to be a better writer than them. And I have to take angles that they don't take. I have to figure out what the holes they're going to leave in their news coverage and cover those stories that they are not going to cover adequately. Um, so I'm in competition. Every journalist is in competition. If they're they're in competition with other media, and they're also in competition with people in their own medium and in their own publication or in their own. I mean, who is going to be on the front page? Do you want to be on the front page or you want to be on page 10? Well, obviously, you want to be on the front page whenever you can. And so you're competing with everybody else on that news staff for getting on the front page. That's where you want to be. And so how you write the story will depend whether you get on that front page. It will also depend whether you can get future jobs in bigger newspapers or other situations that you find desirable. And so you are in competition as a writer, and you need to understand that. And the principles I'm teaching you will be key in your competition, because that's from my experience. So anyway, these other questions all relate to that. As you write your lead, this is part of what I want you to think about too, how to reduce it and make it more powerful. So this is one of the leads I wrote for the bilingual newspaper. So this has a limited, this story was not written for a general interest newspaper. It was written for the publication I was doing for the state of Washington. It was specifically for an audience that were interested in migrant education and bilingual education. So, this may or may not be of interest to everybody. And just to define some terms, achievement gap, when you talk about achievement gap, that's the gap in achievement between the different ethnicities and people of different circumstances. For example, in America, Asians usually are at the top. Next to them are Caucasians. Next to them, you start going down real fast. The Hispanics would probably be next to them if they're established in America. But if they're migrants, then they're going to be the very bottom. So you can kind of divide Hispanics into two groups, those that are established and those that are new. Those that are new at the bottom. In between the established Hispanics and the new Hispanics are the Native Americans. They live on their own reservation. They kind of have their own nations within the nation. And they haven't integrated well despite being the original Americans. They've never integrated into the rest of society in many cases. They have lots of problems, even though many of them are on welfare, many of them get money. They're given, because they have a separate nation, the Supreme Court said, for example, that they could set up gambling casinos on their reservations, and the state could say nothing about it. Even states that had no gambling, who had no gambling for a century, once the Native Americans decided they wanted to have a casino, the Supreme Court said you can't stop them. They're a nation unto themselves. They make their own rules. And so, despite all of that, they've never integrated very well, and they don't do well in school. So basically, when we talk about achievement gap, is how they do in school and compared and nationalized tests and stuff. And so there's a big gap between Asians and the migrant students, a huge gap, obviously, and everywhere in between. They say Caucasians are up close to Asians, but the rest drop quickly. So as part of what I was reporting on, a key part was about how could we bring these groups at the bottom, particularly the migrant students who are the very bottom. They're at the bottom because they don't speak English very well. In many cases, they're at the bottom because they might be living in a car. They may be at the bottom because they've never used a computer before. They're at the bottom for many reasons. Because they're migrant, they may not stay in the same school for more than a few months at a time. And so, and the schools in America do not coordinate all of their curriculum. So you go to one school, you go to another school, they may not be teaching the same classes. They will not be using the same textbook. There's nothing the same. So the migrant program had to figure out how to help these students with all these problems. So, the achievement gap is closing in Washington State, says the State Migrant Education Program Director. That's the concise form. That's the lead I used. But I could have used the second one, which is Dr. Richard Gomez, the State Migrant Education Program Director, says the achievement gap is closing in Washington State, but still has a long ways to go before students of ethnic origin catch up with to white students. That could have been the lead. But hopefully you understand the first one's better. But a lot of the second one could be in paragraph 2. And if there's a direct quote for that, that can be paragraph 3. And so we're trying to, tell the reader as quickly as possible what the story is about in a concise but still interesting and powerful way. And so those who understand the achievement gap issue and that are concerned about that will want to read the story. But you tell it to them quickly and you get on with the story. So again, that was one reason, the textbook that I stole some of my orientation from, that I used myself as a student, I believe, and I felt was taking the right approach to it. Paragraph 2, there is kind of the way that some newspapers still write, because they don't use this formula that this other textbook author recommended, which is the complete lead approach. In other words, if you don't understand the complete lead approach, you're trying to stuff everything into the lead and you get paragraph 2. But if you understand the complete lead approach, you don't have to have everything in paragraph 1. You can reduce paragraph 1 and have the rest of that summarized story in paragraph 2, and it's okay. And so the complete lead approach, I believe, is the best way, and it allows you to write a lead like the top one, and then put anything else necessary that I included in the second example into paragraph 2 as part of your complete lead. Okay, well, we're already past time. Well, those are some of the most important things. We'll get more into some of the interviewing aspects right here, and then I'll get into my book chapter on, I have a chapter on news gathering, the 8 I's of news gathering, but even though there's 8 I's of news gathering, including interviewing, all of the I's relate to interviewing, ultimately. And so we'll go through all 8 I's of information gathering and how they relate to interviewing. And we'll probably do that in the next class so that it'll hopefully help you to do your project too, to do good interviews. But hopefully, with some of our discussion already, you're starting to kind of get an idea of what a good interview is going to require, things you're going to be thinking about the whammy, thinking of which questions to follow up on. You can write some questions ahead of time. And in fact, one of you might want to do, if it's possible, do some research ahead of time. So, if the person you're interviewing or one of the people you're interviewing is somebody you could Google them. If they have a Facebook, go to their Facebook. Find out what you can about them. You might do some other, if your main focus is going to be one person, then you maybe talk to other people about that one person. So that you know what question to ask when you get to the person you presume is going to be your key interview. And so if you were going to interview, for example, the assistant president, then you talk to some department chairs, perhaps, and some of the heads of some of the other departments about the assistant president. Now, when you go in, you first off, you have other interviews done, and you're going in for your main focus on the assistant president. Hopefully you don't just ask easy questions, and hopefully you can get some of these other people to maybe part of your other interview will be off the record. In other words, you're not going to tell the assistant president who said something because it's background. And you need to understand some of the challenges the assistant president is facing. Why, for example, are they only allowing professors to give A's or A minuses to 20% of the students if they've worked hard and deserve it? That's a tough question. You're probably not going to get a department chair to want to say that in a quote and be attributed, because what they say might get them in trouble. And almost by definition, a department chair is a politician, and politicians don't want to get into trouble. That's how if they're a good department chairman, they're a good politician. And so you may have to, like I say, kind of go off the record and say, for background information, what are some of the challenges? And so you get them to tell you about some of the challenges with the agreement that you're not going to include them in the story, except in the very generic, at least not with any attribution. So now you're going anonymous. Well, you are a little bit, but now you're going to directly take it to the assistant president and say, some of the, and you may not even say it was a department chairman. You may suggest that it was a student who raised the question. So you can kind of be a little bit deceptive to protect your sources. You don't want to get your sources into trouble. They're not going to want to talk to you again. And so you may suggest that a student, students have been asking you why, da, 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 da. When you really actually found about, you knew a little bit about it and you asked a department chairman about it. They gave you some more information, but you didn't get them involved and get them in trouble. So you're aware of that. So interviewing some other people may give you some questions when you go into what you perceive to be your main interview for this. So that's one way of doing it. So sometimes you do prepare and you prepare some questions ahead of time. But the last thing you want to do is to be tied to the questions you went in with. To feel like those are the only questions you can ask and you have to ask them. Because as you start interviewing, you may find it's absolutely not the case. As you start interviewing, you may find another whammy altogether. And so you have to be thinking, have the end in mind, when you start your interview, and listen for what they're telling you, and see if maybe, like that interview where the city councilman said he was either going to quit city council or run for mayor or run for some other office because he had his attention pulled too many different directions. I had no expectation of that coming out in our interview, but once I heard that, bam, my whammy had to focus on that. That was clearly the most important thing he had told me. So as you're talking to somebody, you may find that sort of thing happen. You have to be listening for it, listening for the whammy, and listening for key items that you can ask follow-up questions about. Don't just presume that you're going to write your questions ahead of time and those are the only questions you're going to ask. That's the worst kind of interview you can do. And so, yes, you can have some questions. Don't be tied to them. Don't think they're etched in granite, etched in stone. Don't go in with that attitude at all. Okay? If there's no questions, I know I've kept you late, so thank you, and we'll see you tomorrow.